Good afternoon, everyone. So as we know, there have been increasing amount of social protests around the world where global communities are demanding more actions to be taken to confront climate change. In the spirit of increasing uncertainty about public policy, we would like to know how China and the EU can better coordinate to deliver better climate policies. So today we have invited Mr. Neil Hurst, who is the Senior Policy Fellow of Energy and Mitigation at Grantham Institute, Imperial College London with us. He is currently working on a project with China's Energy Research Institute of the NDRC on international energy governance and China's role in it. Thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
So to start off the interview, I would like to discuss with you a few questions on the dynamics and the interactions between China and the EU in climate policies. So I know that you have worked at the International Energy Agency and at several British energy agencies, and you're currently collaborating with China in international energy governance. So what's your insight on the relationship between China and the EU and its climate policies?
Well, I think the important thing is that now that the United States, as long as Donald Trump is still the president, have said that they are pulling out of the Paris Agreement on climate change, it leaves China and Europe as the natural leaders. These are the two most influential nations that are still committed to the Paris Agreement. And I think they are natural allies. There's a big trade between them, certainly in particularly renewable energy. Europe, of course, has announced this green energy program, quite demanding, and I think China has been a big leader in the Paris process. The success of the Paris process was largely based on the agreement of Xi Jinping with the American president of the time, Barack Obama, that they would back the summit. That they both announced big new climate targets on the eve of the summit, and I think that influenced what people did. And so I think there is a great hope that maybe something like this can happen again, but with Europe and China. China is, on the one hand, the biggest emitter, but on the other hand, is a leader in many of the aspects of climate mitigation, particularly renewables, the biggest renewables industry, the biggest implementer of renewables, but also in electric vehicles. China is a huge leader, and in power storage, and in energy transmission, all key technologies for climate mitigation. So I think there are great hopes, certainly on the European side, because I can't very well speak for Europe today, but nevertheless, on the European side, there are great hopes, I think, that of a coming together as we move towards the Glasgow summit at the end of this year. And I'm fairly optimistic. But there is a little frustration, probably, on the European side at how long it is taking for China to control the growth of its coal industry and eventually to reduce the size of its coal industry. So there are tensions, but I think there's great opportunities for them to work together. There's certainly there are regular meetings on this topic between China and European representatives. So I'm optimistic. I think this can be made to work, yes.
I think that's a really perceptive viewpoint, especially given how there is increasing uncertainty in policymakers' decisions as we face increasing amount of uncertainty about what to do next in climate change.
Yes.
Who should be the leaders?
Yes.
So next, I would like to change the focus to China first.
Yes.
So as you have suggested, China still relies on some energy sources which leave heavier carbon footprints, most predominantly coal and as well as other carbon-based fuels. So despite its efforts to conduct a structural transformation, coal industry continues to be very crucial in China. So do you think there's a case for China to learn from the EU and other developed economies, such as the UK, to conduct a successful energy transformation towards more renewable sources?
Well, I think there is, but I think one has to understand the challenges that China faces. I mean, China of course, has achieved an extraordinary economic success, extraordinary poverty alleviation, probably the greatest in world history, in fact, in the last 2 or 3 decades, largely based on coal, as far as energy is concerned. Mm-hmm. The energy has come from coal. It's very difficult to quickly reduce the coal industry. You talk about the examples of Europe.
Yeah.
Well, we in the UK had, historically, our industrial revolution was based on coal. We mined a lot of coal, but our industry became hopelessly uneconomic. We were mining very deep mined coal, narrow seams, and of course in other parts of the world, the coal is abundant near the surface. But we found it very difficult to close our coal industry, even though it was uneconomic, because there's a social side to this. There are a lot of communities that depend on coal mining for their existence, for their livelihoods and so on. So when we closed our coal mining industry, it was very, very painful politically. And a lot of people have still not forgiven the government that closed down the mines and left these mining villages with no employment and so on. So it's very, very difficult. And you can see that Germany has the same problem. Germany presents itself as a world leader in the transfer to low carbon energy, but still has a very big coal mining industry. I noticed that Chancellor Merkel announced a plan to close down the coal mining industry. There are going to be, I think, 50 billion euros of subsidies. Not everyone thinks this will succeed. So I just wanted to say, it is very difficult to, and so to that extent, I sympathize with the Chinese situation. But it will have to be tackled. And it is disappointing because 2 or 3 years ago, everyone thought that China's coal industry had peaked and was starting to decline. Yeah. And then in 2017 and 2018, it just started to grow again a little bit. So, the short answer to your question is yes, I hope that China can find a way to run down its coal industry, to find the issues are social, to find social support, retraining, job creation in the areas that makes it politically possible to run down its coal industry, because, of course, it is an urgent problem from the point of view of climate change.
Yeah. So I do hope that China also learns some lessons, such as how to build a better social consensus when it comes to such a supply-side transformation like that. And we obviously know that any decision made by China will have very global impacts. So speaking of global impacts, we noticed that the Belt and Road Initiative has been actively promoted by China over the past few years, and many would argue that this has added uncertainty to global climate action. Yes. So do you think that the BRI actually added uncertainty and probably problems to the climate action? And maybe how can China better navigate this initiative?
Well, Belt and Road also can contribute to raising living standards and reducing poverty in a lot of the countries that is in Central Asia and so on, where they badly need infrastructure and power. But it is true that at the moment, in the energy sector, Belt and Road is, I think, we were discussing this, but I think it's 30 or 40% energy. And a significant amount of that is investment in new coal generators in countries like Pakistan, Indonesia, Kenya, and so on. In fact, quite a large part of the world's new coal power is a part of Belt and Road. So it is very important that Belt and Road should change direction in this way, and certainly President Xi Jinping has set high environmental standards for Belt and Road. In his thought, he champions beautiful China, and China, it was translated, the translation I saw was a kind of be a torchbearer for international, I don't know exactly how that reads in Chinese, but anyway, a leader, a leader. So I think the direction of policy at the highest level is in the right direction, but it has got, it will need to shift, because we cannot afford to build. Well, I say we cannot. A feature of the Belt and Road is that it's based on these bilateral memoranda between China and the beneficiary countries.
Yeah.
And China's philosophy is very much not to try to impose its own ideas on these countries, but to support them in whatever their ideas. So there's some truth in the fact that you may find when you go to Pakistan and you say, what do you want? They might say, we want coal plant. And of course it's a very poor country. They need the power. They need, many of these countries, the power is unreliable and doesn't really. So it is a bit of a dilemma. And in the short term, I can understand why some of these, have their own coal industry, they can, and all the rest of it. And they are relatively efficient state coal stations that China has built. But it has to change, and I think it is changing. I think we will find that of new proposals coming forward in Belt and Road, I'm fairly optimistic that more and more of them will be for solar and wind. Because, of course, these are things that China, obviously China is self-interested in Belt and Road.
Yes.
And China can export coal power stations and turbines and so on. It has the industry to supply them. It has surplus capacity. But it also has capacity of solar and wind energy. So hopefully, that's rather a long answer. But yes, I understand why it has got into this situation. But it is a problem. It's one of the things I'm sure Europe will want to engage with China on, and it's indeed one of the things that I will be working on with the Energy Research Institute of China.
So maybe a possible solution is to offer some minimum environmental standards, or to basically change the terms of the deal whenever we can.
Yes, there are guidelines. There are green guidelines for Belt and Road, and there's an agreement between the City of London and Chinese financial institutions to produce green guidelines. The green guidelines are a little bit vague, I would say. They don't quite. So hopefully, this is what I will be discussing. How can you strengthen them, make them much more, and because Belt and Road is actually driven by the big Chinese state-owned companies. They're the people who are making the investments, and the big Chinese banks. Whereas in Beijing, in the government, in the NDRC, I think people want to see change. I'm not sure that they have quite got the other players round the table for this. And that's what they will need to do, yes.
That's really inspiring. And we understand that Europe also plays a very important role when it comes to engaging China. So as you have said, when it comes to China's own policies, it not only needs to listen to itself or reflect on what it has done, but also to look at what the other party has done, in this case Europe.
Yes.
So let's focus on Europe from now on. So we know that Europe has been a pioneer in many policy interventions. For example, its widespread introduction of the emissions trading system.
Yes.
And recently there is another development where Europe is hoping to release its decision to implement the carbon border adjustment mechanism.
Yes.
And so what's your view on that single mechanism, along with other policies that Europe is hoping to flush out, especially given a new age of Europe with different leaders and different cultures?
Well, carbon border mechanisms are quite difficult, in my opinion, because you are exporting you're trying to export your low carbon policies to other countries. And that may be quite painful. To some extent, China still, but if you see countries like India or, say, Vietnam, countries that are, China built its revolution, its industrial revolution, initially by selling rather basic products to developed countries, Europe and so on. And that's how it sort of took off. And to some extent, it still relies on that, but to a much lesser extent. But other up-and-coming countries are very dependent on that. And so if you say, we're going to import a border tax on your imports, which will bear especially heavily, by the way, on these kinds of basic products, because they tend to be energy intensive. That's a rather unfriendly act. And it could even rebound in terms of emissions. Because if you imagine you're having a meeting and you're saying, let's get together on climate change. And you say, well, first of all, we're going to impose a tax on your imports. Well, that isn't necessarily going to be encourage people to cooperate. So I see why Europe feels there may be a need for this, but I think it's got to be introduced in cooperation. I don't think it should be a unilateral sort of almost hostile act. I think it's got to be part of a negotiation. And I think it is connected, by the way, with the question of how rapidly China introduces its carbon trading mechanism. And of course, the great dream of environmentalists, including me, is that eventually the Chinese trading mechanism will correspond with the European mechanism. There will be carbon trading between them, and there will be incentives at similar levels. And then, of course, there will be no need at all for these carbon taxes. So that's my dream. But maybe they're necessary first, but yeah, you've got to open a discussion about winning acceptance for them. Yeah.
And maybe a productive discussion is more possible if we have two main parties, China and Europe, aligned together to tell the rest of the world that we are going to collaborate and be open with each other.
Yes.
So I think that's really inspiring to me.
Okay.
Finally, I would like to talk to you about the recent global climate movements, such as the one that has been started and promoted by the environmentalist Greta Thunberg.
Yes.
So I understand there has been a backlash in China towards the radical view about climate change, which was at the heart of these movements. So what do you think about the public's reaction towards the radical view? And do you see a way that we can possibly reconcile these differences among these different parties?
Well, I think in Europe, probably, and America, I think this Extinction Rebellion, that's what you're talking about, has its place because I think it has raised the profile of climate mitigation as an issue, and I don't think there really has been in Europe much of a backlash. I mean, some of the things she says, in my opinion, are patently unrealistic. We're not going to have zero carbon in the next 10 years. Yeah. It's not going to happen, and it's sort of a bit silly to. And I think the whole climate debate is a little bit of a problem. That you've got people are rushing to set tough targets, but they're not rushing to actually do the things that would enable them to meet it. So, targets are part of the process. They have a legitimate role, I think, in Europe. But I'm really interested to hear what you say, that in China there's been a sort of backlash. I mean, I sort of understand that because China is a developing nation. I think if people, I imagine a lot of people who are not very wealthy in China, if they feel that this radical environmental movement is actually an enemy of economic development in the most straightforward way, then I suppose I can imagine a backlash. So maybe in China it's not. Maybe it's not. I don't know.
I think the backlash is more from the perspective that she should be more pragmatic. So maybe rather than calling for actions, maybe doing the actions themselves.
Yes, I agree. No, I think that's one of the notable things about, and I think actually the Green movement generally is they shout about targets and what other people should do, the oil companies or the governments and so on. But I notice there's never anything about what they should do. I haven't, all right, she, on one occasion she took a boat instead of flying, fine, but the members, I mean, maybe I've missed this, but I haven't heard that the members of Extinction Rebellion have said, that they won't fly or they won't drive internal combustion vehicles, or that they won't heat their homes more than, I don't know, what's a reasonably cool, 17 degrees. I've never heard them, anyone. So, I would like to see the conversation turn a bit closer to, what people are willing to do.
That's really inspiring, and I think despite these so-called backlash, I think the general public remains very passionate about building a case for action and actually making an effort to move together towards a cleaner world. So that concludes our interview today, and many thanks.
Thank you very much
for joining us today.
Thank you.